Welcome to Glisso English. Real life stories.
Managing the needs of a toddler and an aging parent at the same time is one of the biggest challenges a person can face. In today's story, we follow Sarah, a woman caught in the middle of what many call the sandwich generation. One afternoon, the unthinkable happens. While Sarah is trying to settle her crying toddler for a nap, she hears a loud crash from the bathroom where her elderly mother was getting ready. In this video, we will explore 10 chapters of this intense emotional journey. You will learn important professional vocabulary and idioms related to caregiving, crisis management, and the mental load. Let's dive into Chapter 1 and see how Sarah handles the pressure when two different generations need her at the exact same time. The air in the house was thick with the scent of lavender baby lotion and the sharp, rhythmic wails of a tired toddler. Sarah paced the nursery floor, her arms aching as she swayed 2-year-old Toby. He was fighting sleep with every ounce of his small being, his face a frantic shade of red. "Just close your eyes, sweetie," she whispered, her own voice cracking from exhaustion. This was the delicate dance of the afternoon nap, the only hour of the day Sarah usually had to breathe, to work, or to simply sit in silence. Then, the silence she craved was shattered by a sound that made her heart stop. A heavy, hollow thud echoed from the hallway, followed by the clatter of a plastic cup hitting the floor. It came from the guest bathroom, where her mother, Martha, had gone just moments before. Sarah froze. In her arms, Toby let out a fresh, piercing shriek, startled by the noise. "Mom?" Sarah called, her voice tight with a sudden cold dread. No answer. "Mom, are you okay?" The only response was a low, pained moan that barely carried through the heavy wooden door. Sarah stood in the center of the nursery, a physical bridge between two crises. Toby was arching his back, screaming louder than ever, his needs immediate and loud. But the silence from the bathroom was far more terrifying. She had reached the tipping point of the sandwich generation, the moment where you are pulled in two directions until you feel like you might snap. Sarah's breath hitched as the weight of the situation settled into her chest. Toby was now a cyclone of motion in her arms, his tiny fists drumming against her shoulders as he wailed. Every instinct told her to soothe the child, but the silence from the hallway was a vacuum that demanded her attention. She rushed toward the bathroom door, her hip bumping against the wall in her haste, while still clutching the thrashing toddler. "Mom, please speak to me!" she shouted over Toby's cries, her hand trembling as she reached for the brass doorknob. The door was locked, a safety habit her mother had kept for decades, now turned into a terrifying barrier. Sarah felt a cold sweat prickle her neck as she realized she was physically trapped between a door she couldn't open and a child she couldn't put down. She knelt on the floor, tucking Toby into the crook of her arm despite his protests, and pressed her ear against the wood. Through the muffled sounds of Toby sobbing, she heard a faint, shaky breath and the scrape of a slipper on tile. I'm here, Sarah," Martha finally drifted through, thin and fragile like parchment paper. The relief was momentary, quickly replaced by the logistical nightmare of the next move. Sarah knew she couldn't leave Toby alone on the stairs or in the nursery while she dealt with a potential medical emergency. She was a human pivot point, trying to balance the needs of the beginning of life with the vulnerabilities of the end of it. The hallway felt smaller than ever, a narrow canyon where her roles as mother and daughter were colliding with violent force. "Don't move, Mom," Sarah commanded, her voice regaining a sliver of professional steel. "I'm going to get the spare key, and I'm bringing Toby with me. Just stay still." She stood up, her muscles screaming from the awkward weight, and began the frantic search for the emergency key hidden atop the doorframe. The mental load she had read about in articles wasn't a theory anymore. It was the physical ache in her back and the pounding rhythm of her heart. Sarah's fingers scrambled along the dusty top of the doorframe until they brushed against the cold metal of the emergency key. She fumbled with the lock, her hands slick with sweat, while Toby's cries transitioned into a ragged, exhausted whimper. With a sharp click, the door swung open, revealing a scene that made Sarah's stomach do a slow, nauseating flip. Martha was slumped against the side of the bathtub, her face pale and her floral robe twisted awkwardly around her legs. "Oh, Mom," Sarah breathed, quickly lowering a still sobbing Toby to the rug by the door, keeping one hand firmly on his chest to keep him from crawling toward the danger. The bathroom felt impossibly crowded, the air was humid, and the floor was dangerously slick near the sink. Sarah performed a quick triage, her eyes darting between her mother's bruised arm and Toby's tear-streaked face. She reached out to check Martha's pulse, her touch light and careful, trying to maintain a sense of calm she didn't actually feel. "I just slipped, honey," whispered Martha, her eyes clouded with a mix of pain and deep, stinging embarrassment. For a woman who had spent 40 years as a fiercely independent teacher, being found on the floor was a blow to her dignity as much as her body. Sarah realized that grace in this moment wasn't just about moving carefully, it was about protecting her mother's pride while managing her son's fear. She coached her mother through a series of slow breaths, assessing the damage, while Toby finally began to quiet down, mesmerized by the intensity of the adult interaction. The physical strain of helping Martha shift into a more comfortable position was immense, pulling at Sarah's lower back. Every movement was a calculated risk, a heavy-stakes puzzle where one wrong step could lead to another fall or a panicked child. Gravity seemed stronger in this room, tugging at the limbs of the elderly and the eyelids of the young. Sarah managed to prop her mother up against a stack of towels, creating a temporary safe harbor in the middle of the chaos. She was the glue holding these two fragile generations together, her own strength the only thing preventing a total collapse. As she looked from the woman who gave her life to the boy she had brought into the world, the reality of her new life settled in. The decision was made the moment Sarah saw the swelling on her mother's wrist. She managed to pack a survival bag in under 3 minutes. Diapers, a coloring book, Martha's blood pressure medication, and a lukewarm bottle of water. Now they were huddled in the corner of a crowded emergency room waiting area, a place where time seemed to stretch and distort. The atmosphere was a thick cocktail of antiseptic spray, muffled coughing, and the low hum of a television news cycle. Sarah sat on a hard plastic chair, acting as a human anchor for her family. On her left, Martha leaned against her shoulder, her eyes closed as she tried to breathe through the throbbing pain in her arm. On her right, Toby was squirming in his stroller, his patience wearing thin as the ER picnic began. Sarah handed him pieces of a crushed granola bar one by one, trying to keep him quiet so the triage nurse wouldn't see them as a disruption. "How much longer?" Martha asked, her voice a fragile thread that threatened to break. "We're next on the list," Sarah lied gently, smoothing back her mother's silver hair. Being a part of the sandwich generation meant becoming a master of the pivot, translating medical questions for her mother while making airplane noises with a spoon for Toby. Every time a doctor walked past, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline, hoping for a diagnosis but fearing the recovery plan. She watched other families in the waiting room, some elderly, some with young children, but few were doing both at once. She felt like a tightrope walker performing without a net, trying to keep her balance while two different worlds pulled at her sleeves.
Toby finally fell asleep in his stroller, his thumb tucked into his mouth, while Martha drifted into a fitful doze against Sarah's arm. In the rare silence of the moment, Sarah looked down at her lap and saw the bruises on her own arms from the day's struggle. She was the protector, the translator, and the provider, all while sitting in a room full of strangers. When the nurse finally called Martha Miller, Sarah took a deep breath, braced her core, and pushed the stroller with one hand while guiding her mother with the other.
The drive home from the hospital was quiet, but the house they returned to felt fundamentally altered. The elder-proofing began immediately, a surreal mirror to the baby-proofing Sarah had finished only a year prior. While Toby napped in his crib, Sarah spent the afternoon rearranging the living room, moving rugs that were now considered trip hazards, and clearing wide paths for a walker. She found herself installing grab bars in the bathroom next to the colorful rubber ducks and the non-slip bath mat shaped like a frog. It was a strange domestic collision, the tools of a beginning life sitting side by side with the tools of a declining one. Martha sat in the recliner watching Sarah work with a look of quiet, heavy resignation in her eyes. "I feel like a ghost in my own skin, Sarah," her mother whispered, watching her daughter hide the sharp-edged coffee table. Sarah stopped, a roll of non-slip tape in her hand, feeling the weight of that sentence settle in her gut. She realized that her mother wasn't just losing her balance, she was losing her sense of self-governance. In this chapter of their lives, Sarah was no longer just a daughter or just a mother, she was a manager of vulnerabilities. She had to navigate the ghosts of who her mother used to be while raising the person her son was becoming. Every time she checked the baby monitor, she found herself glancing toward her mother's room too, listening for the sound of a footfall or a sigh. The house was full of movement, yet there was a haunting sense of transition that Sarah couldn't shake. She was guarding two different thresholds, one child stepping into the world and one parent slowly retreating from it. The evening shadows stretched across the floor, highlighting the new, sterile modifications to their once cozy home. Sarah realized that home was no longer a place of rest, but a facility she had to run with clinical precision. She sat on the floor between the recliner and the crib, a silent sentry in a house caught between two lifetimes. The mental transition was the hardest part. She had to accept that the woman who once raised her now relied on her to stay upright. The invisible burn of exhaustion began to seep into Sarah's bones like a slow-acting fever. It wasn't a sudden flame, but a steady, draining heat that came from being on every second of the day. While the rest of the world measured time in hours, Sarah measured it in intervals, the gap between Toby's snacks and Martha's physical therapy exercises. She sat at the kitchen table with a mountain of paperwork, her eyes blurring as she tried to cross-reference insurance claims with daycare invoices. The mental load was a physical weight, a phantom backpack filled with appointments, dosage timings, and grocery lists for two very different diets. She found herself standing in the middle of the kitchen, holding a bottle of milk in one hand and a pill organizer in the other, momentarily forgetting which one was for whom. The guilt was the sharpest part of the burn, the feeling that by giving 50% to her son and 50% to her mother, she was failing them both. When she played blocks with Toby, her mind was in the other room, listening for the sound of her mother's walker. When she helped Martha with her bandages, she felt a pang of regret for the story time she was missing upstairs. She was a woman divided, a human bridge being marched across from both ends until the structural integrity began to creak.
The premium life she had envisioned for her family felt like it was slipping through her fingers, replaced by a survivalist's grind. She stopped looking in the mirror because the person staring back looked like a stranger, someone defined entirely by what she did for others. Her own needs had become a non-priority item, pushed to the very bottom of a list that never ended. Even in the middle of the night, her brain refused to power down, looping through what-if scenarios like a broken record. What if the daycare closes? What if Mom falls again? What if I simply run out of steam? The silence of the house at 3 a.m. wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with the expectation of the next day's demands. Sarah realized that caregiving wasn't just an act of love. It was a high-speed management job with no weekends and no salary. She took a long, shaky breath, closed her laptop, and leaned her forehead against the cool surface of the table, just for a moment of darkness. The morning light filtered through the living room curtains, casting long golden stripes across the hardwood floor. Sarah stood in the doorway, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip, and paused at the sight before her. The house was unusually quiet, devoid of the usual friction between a restless toddler and a weary grandmother. Toby was sitting on the colorful playmat, his legs tucked under him, holding a plastic yellow dinosaur with intense focus. Opposite him, Martha sat in her walker's seat, her injured wrist resting on a pillow, watching him with a soft, distant smile. Without a word, Toby reached out and placed the dinosaur on Martha's knee, a silent offering from his world to hers. Martha chuckled, a sound Sarah hadn't heard in weeks, and moved her good hand to walk the toy across the fabric of her trousers. "Roar," Martha whispered, her voice playful and light, mimicking the sound Toby made when he was happy. Toby giggled, his eyes lighting up as he realized his grandmother understood the rules of his game. In that moment, they had created a language of their own, one that didn't require complex sentences or professional jargon. Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders drop an inch as she realized these two were the only ones who truly understood the pace of the house. Both were living in the now, unburdened by the schedules and the mental load that kept Sarah awake at night. To Toby, Martha wasn't a patient or reliability. She was a friend who was always there, someone who moved at his speed. To Martha, Toby wasn't a distraction or a burden. He was a reminder of the continuity of life, a spark of pure, uncomplicated joy. They were anchored to each other by a shared sense of vulnerability and a mutual need for simple human presence. Sarah watched them for another minute, a lump forming in her throat as she witnessed the sandwich becoming a circle. She realized that while she was busy managing the logistics of their lives, they were busy managing the spirit of the home. It was a rare moment of equilibrium, a brief truce in the daily battle against time and exhaustion. She quietly backed away, leaving the laundry for later, allowing the two people she loved most to inhabit their private, wordless world. The fragile peace of the previous afternoon vanished under the weight of a Tuesday morning that felt designed to break her. It started with a leak in the kitchen, followed quickly by Toby refusing to wear his shoes, and the final straw, Martha's physical therapy appointment, was rescheduled to the exact middle of Sarah's most important work call. Sarah stood in the hallway, the phone pressed to her ear, while Toby began a full-throttled tantrum on the floor because his toast was cut into triangles instead of squares. At the same moment, Martha called out from the bedroom, her voice laced with frustration as she struggled to fasten a button with her one good hand. The air in the house seemed to vibrate with a high-pitched frequency that only Sarah could hear, the sound of her own limits being reached. Then it happened. A glass of orange juice, left precariously on the edge of the counter, was swept away by a stray movement and shattered across the tile. Sarah didn't move. She didn't even shout. She simply stood over the puddle of sticky liquid and glittering shards and felt the first sob hitch in her throat. It wasn't a motherly cry or a daughterly sigh. It was a primal, gut-wrenching release of every ounce of pressure she had carried for months. She sat down right there on the kitchen floor, careful to avoid the glass, and buried her face in her hands. The breaking point wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a quiet, total surrender to the fact that she was human. Toby stopped his screaming, startled by the sight of his mother, the immovable pillar of his world, crumbling into tears. Martha appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily on her walker, her eyes wide with a realization of the toll she had inadvertently placed on her child. "I can't do it," Sarah whispered into her palms, the words finally out in the open. "I can't be everything for everyone, every second of every day." The house went silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock and the hum of the refrigerator. For the first time since the fall, the roles shifted. Sarah wasn't the caregiver. She was the one who needed to be held. Martha navigated her walker over to her daughter, reached down with her trembling hand, and gently stroked Sarah's hair. "I know, honey," Martha said softly, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I know."
The morning after the breakdown, Sarah didn't wake up with a solution, but she woke up with a boundary. She realized that being a superwoman was a recipe for a slow, silent collapse that would leave both Toby and Martha without a foundation. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was actually hot for once, and she opened her laptop with a new objective. It was time to call in the Cavalry, a term her father used to use for the reinforcements that make a victory possible. The first call was to a local senior collective, inquiring about a part-time companion who could sit with Martha for 3 hours a week. The second was to a mother's helper, a teenager from down the street who could play blocks with Toby while Sarah focused on her professional deadlines. Sarah felt a pang of the old guilt, a voice in her head whispering that she should be able to handle this alone, but she silenced it with a deep, deliberate breath. "Asking for help isn't a sign of weakness," she muttered to herself, practicing the English of self-preservation. When her brother called from 2 states away, Sarah didn't give the usual "everything is fine" update. Instead, she was blunt about the physical and emotional cost. "I need you to come for a weekend," she said, her voice firm. "I need to be just Sarah for 48 hours, not a nurse or a nanny." The transition was awkward at first, as the house filled with the presence of outsiders and new routines. Sarah had to learn to delegate, to trust that someone else could prepare a safe meal for Martha or soothe a Toby tantrum. She spent the first few hours of her free time just sitting in her car at a local park, staring at the trees and relearning the sound of her own thoughts. She realized that by creating a support system, she wasn't outsourcing her love, she was protecting it. The mental load began to lighten, not because the tasks disappeared, but because they were finally shared. Martha seemed to thrive with a new person to talk to, and Toby enjoyed the fresh energy of a new playmate. The house began to feel less like a pressurized chamber and more like a community, a small ecosystem built on mutual aid. Sarah looked at her to-do list and saw that for the first time in months there was a slot labeled rest. She realized that to take care of the people she loved, she first had to stop being the only one holding the weight of the world.
The final chapter of this journey wasn't marked by a return to the old life, but by the quiet acceptance of a new rhythm. The house was still loud, and the schedule was still tight, but the atmosphere had shifted from one of panic to one of sustainable grace. Sarah stood in the kitchen preparing a dinner that somehow managed to satisfy a toddler's simple tastes and her mother's dietary needs. She moved with a newfound efficiency, no longer hurried by the ghost of a looming breakdown, but guided by a realistic understanding of her own energy. In the living room, the sandwich had found its center. Toby was showing Martha how to use a tablet, their heads bent together in a shared moment of digital discovery. The Brab bars and the baby gates were no longer eyesores to Sarah. They were the scaffolding of a home that cared for its occupants at every stage of life. She realized that the sandwich generation wasn't just a label for a difficult period. It was a testament to the strength of the middle. She had learned to navigate the complex professional vocabulary of healthcare and the simple emotional idioms of a child's love. There were still days that felt like a climb up a steep mountain, but she now had the tools and the support system to reach the summit. She took a moment to step onto the back porch, breathing in the cool evening air and listening to the distant sounds of her family inside. The guilt that once burned so bright had cooled into a steady sense of pride. She was the bridge, and she was holding firm. Sarah walked back inside, kissed the top of Toby's head, and sat down on the sofa next to her mother. "How are we doing?" she asked, her voice calm and grounded in the present moment. "We're doing just fine, Sarah," Martha replied, reaching over to squeeze her daughter's hand with a strength that was slowly returning. The story didn't end with a happily ever after where the problems disappeared, but with a happily right now where the family was together. The chaos had become a chorus, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. She picked up a book, leaned back, and allowed herself to simply exist in the middle of the life she had so carefully built. The sandwich was full, it was messy, and it was beautiful, and Sarah was finally at peace with her place in it.
The journey of the sandwich generation is rarely about finding a perfect solution, but rather about finding a sustainable pace. Through Sarah's story, we see that the greatest strength doesn't come from doing everything alone, but from the courage to be vulnerable and ask for help. By the final chapter, the house isn't just a place of caregiving, it is a space where 3 generations learn to support one another in a new, honest rhythm. It is a reminder that while the middle can be a high-pressure place to live, it is also where the most profound connections are made. Thank you so much for following Sarah's journey through the 10 chapters of the Sandwich Generation. We hope this story helped you visualize the real-life challenges of balancing the needs of a growing child and an aging parent. More importantly, we hope it provided you with useful professional vocabulary and idioms to help you describe complex emotions and logistical struggles in English. Remember, whether you are a caregiver, a parent, or simply a student of the language, the most important lesson is to pace yourself and build a community of support. If you enjoyed this narrative approach to learning English, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Glisso for more stories about real-life problems. You can find all the vocabulary of the story in the description box. How would you handle a day like Sarah's? Let us know in the comments below using some of the vocabulary we covered today. See you in the next story. Goodbye.